Righto, we're basically at the end game now. When we left, we were headed to the Lunatic Pandora. It's finally time to wrap this up. This is the last proper part. Before that, there is a couple of little things that I want to analyse. First up, I've said it before, but holy hell is this game divisive. I knew that going in, but Jesus, this is the most divisive game I have ever reviewed. Final Fantasy games always inspire discussion, but even the slightest mention of FF8 will spawn pages of it filled with those who love the game and those who utterly hate it. I've seen it myself, not just in the first part's comments, but in threads that have spawned from it on places like NeoGAF. You don't often see the game in the middle of people's Final Fantasy lists. It's either at or near the top, or down at the bottom. My own opinion of the game is kind of complex, so I'm saving it. But I do understand both sides. If you embrace the love story side of the game, and if you gel with Squall as a character, you may well fall in love with it. As I said before, I have also seen lots of people who love how open FF8's gameplay system is, and how things are available to you so easily. But that's also a valid criticism, in that the reason for it is because the game is so broken and the junction system just doesn't work. And it's hard to ignore the flights of fancy that the game takes, that it comes up with these completely illogical things and then tries to justify it with time compression, as if that makes sense. Sometimes people's criticisms do get a bit skew-if, like when people say that Squall doesn't have any kind of arc as a character when his arc is probably bigger than most any other FF protagonist, but still there are some strong negatives against the game. Even still though, I'm not sure if all that justifies FF8 being such an emotional topic. There is something weird about this game, something that just pulls you into writing shit tons about it. Maybe because it's so different from every Final Fantasy game that came before or since. For my part, I came into FF8 expecting to do a single video, and look at where we're at now. These differences will become even clearer as we do reach the ending, but it's hard to sum up even now. The ways that the game tries to integrate gameplay with story, the relationship between Seifer and Squall as a reversal and distortion of the traditional protagonist and antagonist, the makeup of our group and how they're all so purposefully similar to each other, important pieces of the story's puzzle being hidden away, and the usage of realistically proportioned characters in order to mainly tell the story through animations and gestures. These are all things that Final Fantasy VIII tried to do very differently compared to anything they'd done before. Not also forgetting the fact that this is so very much a young adult story aimed at a specific market, in a way that, again, I don't think any other Final Fantasy had been before or since. Even if not all of that works, it's certainly an interesting journey for those reasons alone. Right, well, on we go then, to the Pandora. We crash into its barrier and with the help of Ragnarok's guns, open a hole up that we can squeeze through. Selphie's at the controls and she's having the time of her life. Seriously, this is the best moment ever for her. We make it through and touch down on the obelisk, where straight away we meet up with Fujin and Raijin. It seems that they're still defending Seifer, even if it's out of nothing but friendship and loyalty, and it's now time to make good on the promise we made in Balaam. As with the first Fujin and Raijin battle, this one can be a problem if you're not prepared sufficiently. However, we are, so they fall, and once again, they make the tactical decision to retreat. Just as we enter the Pandora, we run into another duo, Biggs and Wedge. They're not happy, although this time it's not because they've seen us, and in fact our presence barely registers. They're more annoyed at the grunt work that they have to do in this big monolith filled with monsters. In fact, they're so annoyed that they say fuck it and decide to go off and have a drink. This scene is quite symbolic actually. It's the end of the G-Army in our story, and basically the end of Galbadia's involvement. The G-Army have been replaced by monsters from the Lunar Cry inside the Pandora, and they've had enough. We fought our last G-Soldier the first time we tried to get into the Pandora. This should clue you in on something. Even though Galbadia managed to get the Pandora here and help set off the Lunar Cry, they haven't actually directed anything for a long time. And now, as far as Galbadia itself goes, there's only Seifer left, and possibly Fujin and Raijin too. This isn't a triumphant moment, it's a last stand, and part of the reason for coming here is to finish them off. The Pandora is an odd little dungeon. Most of it is optional, and the only reason to go around it much at all is if you did a lot of the optional stuff that was around in Laguna's second flashback, when the Crystal Pillar was being excavated. If you did, then there is some good treasure around. If you didn't, well, sod it, just move on with the plot. The main interesting thing though is the monsters. They're all piss easy and die in one hit, with barely any experience gained. The justification is that these monsters are all totally new, and that it's basically their first battle, therefore they're absolutely no match for us. You wonder why this doesn't apply to the monsters outside that touch down after the Lunar Crime, mind you. I guess you could say that those ones could have got busy cutting down Estar's soldiers and the like, but it's a stretch. Something like that though is where you have to balance between the story and the gameplay considerations. Our next big fight is with the robot who dumped Zell and company out of the Lunatic Pandora last time around. This is pretty much Fusion and Raijin's last roll of the dice. This time when we actually face the thing, yeah, it tends to blow up kinda quickly. Shame we didn't just engage it in combat the first time around, quite frankly. I mean, we were all junctioned, we could have destroyed the bloody thing. And then at last we come into contact with Seifer. Fusion and Raijin are here too, and they're holding alone. Seifer commands his friends to fight us once again, and they decide to let Alone go, and she promptly runs back to Ragnarok. At last, they've truly had enough. Fusion drops her usual speech and talks to Seifer normally in order to convince him that it's over and to stop the act. Because they're his friends, they want to help him. It's quite a strong scene and a great development for these two side characters. Fusion and Raijin are a fairly underrated portion of the game, to be honest. One look at Seifer should also tell you something about his own mental state. His once splendid white coat is now tattered and torn. There's truly nothing else behind him now, well, aside from his fascination with Ultimecia. In the end, pride, along with control, won't let him stop. He dismisses his friends, although not without a salute, and we have to fight him for the last time. The final Seifer fight starts with a pretty outrageous moment, so long as you have Odin, the summoning of Zantetsuken. Everything plays out as it often does, with Odin ready to cut Seifer in half, but then Seifer's blade cuts him in half. Odin's steel-cutting sword flies up and into the hand of an unseen individual. This sets up Seifer pretty damn well for one final awesome encounter which, well, you don't get if you're prepared. Seifer himself is still just kind of weak, honestly. The best thing about him is that you draw aura from him, and that's what I spent the battle doing, until the unnamed figure from earlier is suddenly summoned, at which point he knocks Seifer for 6. If you know Final Fantasy, then you know that this is Gilgamesh. It is in fact the same Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V, where he was an antagonist. After being caught in the interdimensional rift at the end of said game, he ends up here after coming through a portal. Gilgamesh is a recurring character in Final Fantasy, but this was his first proper appearance in the series since the 5th game. This appearance is kind of a cool Easter egg. Now that Odin is gone, and he is gone, Gilgamesh takes his role. He appears randomly in battles to help you out with one of 4 attacks, including Zantetsuken. He can also deal big damage with Masamune, another common FF sword, and Excalibur. If you're unlucky, he'll use Excalibur, a cheap knockoff of the latter sword which deals a single point of damage to all enemies. And of course, if you never actually got Odin in the game, you don't get any of this at all, and you just fight Seifer normally. And so it appears that Seifer is finally done. Rinoa is a little conflicted about this and kind of walks away. But he's not done. In fact, he sprints back up and, sensing the opportunity, captures Rinoa off screen. At which point Zell comes in, seemingly all the way from the Ragnarok, to tell us just that, even though she walked off screen seconds ago. A bit silly, but whatever. Disc 3 ends just as Seifer is about to shove Rinoa into the arms of the waiting Adele, but we're still right in the middle of everything, so there's no time to stop. The presence of another sorceress to possess wakes Adele stroke Ultimecia up, and she embraces Rinoa, meaning of course that we finally have to fight Adele. It's a fairly gruesome sight. This can be a tricky battle again because you're on a time limit. Adele drains health from Rinoa, and if she dies, then the game is over. You also have to be careful not to actually hit Rinoa, so no spells that damage everyone. In fact, you absolutely should not do what I did here, which was to stick Aura on Squall and use Renzokuken. I was lucky in that this Renzo didn't have a finishing blow. If it had, well, I'd have probably killed Rinoa. As it is, it just killed Adele instead. With Rinoa freed from Adele's grasp, Alone sends her back in time so that Ultimecia can cast the time compression spell before quickly bringing her back. At least, that's what I think happens. The plot is so crazy right now that truthfully I'm not too sure. In any case, the time compression begins, a long FMV sequence. At the end of it, we have this weird fight where basically we go against several different generic sorceresses through many ages and surroundings. It's not a difficult fight, it's just kind of long. I suppose that through doing this we are kind of fulfilling the role of Seed and the goal of Ultimecia. Seed were made to combat aggressive sorceresses, and we're doing that. Ultimecia also wishes to be the one single all-powerful sorceress, and after time compression is over, she now is. At last the spell is completed, and the party find themselves in the future, just outside Ultimecia's castle, the final dungeon. Phew. Well, I don't really know what to say about the plot goings on. Again, it does kind of make me understand why people get so annoyed with the game. It really does get a bit too much with all the time compression stuff, the alone bit, Rinoa suddenly getting captured again. How many times is that now? There's some great FMVs and set pieces, of that there is no doubt, but the plot that hands them all together does become quite weak. And Ultimecia is, well, we're going to be fighting her, aren't we? Short of seeing her personality when she was controlling a deer, there's so little that we know. Is she just a throwback to the final bosses in older Final Fantasy games, the really big monsters that we didn't know a lot about who were the cause of other goings-on, as opposed to being more like the Kefkas and Sephiroths? Was Seifer the true primary antagonist this whole time? There's more ponderings, and there's that other theory too. We'll get to it. Just before we head off to that final dungeon, I'd like to talk a little about the game's music. While generally it's of the same high quality of most Nobuo Uematsu soundtracks, it's still quite different in a way. There's less emphasis on individual character themes, more on big unifying melodies that you often hear repeated throughout the game. It's constructed differently from other Final Fantasies in that regard, although there are some notable themes that repeat for characters, such as Laguna's Man with the Machine Gun or Rinoa's My Mind. The soundtrack isn't as typically catchy as a lot of the FF soundtracks, but it's definitely moody and no less of a soundtrack for that. And the cornerstones of the series, such as dungeon themes, battle themes and boss themes, are really freaking great all of the time. And yet it's still kind of an underrated soundtrack by some, maybe due to the couple of missteps there are. Not many people tend to like the world map theme or the Esfar theme. Still, it's strong work regardless, and as we get to the end of the game, I thought it deserved something of a mention. So, here we are then, Ultimecia's castle. Now we can go outside if we wish. There are some portals that take us back to the world map. You can also find Ragnarok again. You have to go to a chocobo forest in the central continent, find a chocobo so you can get over shallow water, and then you can get the ship back. Mind you, the world is a wholly different place now. Oh, by the way, if this is the first time you've caught a chocobo, you're treated to an explanation of something called Chocobo World, which might confuse you. This was a minigame that you could play on something called a pocket station with your save. It was kind of like Sony's answer to the Dreamcast's VMU. You walk the chocobo around, fight enemies, and you can gain unique items and even a GF or two for the main game by using it. However, the Pocket Station was never released outside of Japan. Chances are most folk have never played it, although it is available on the Steam edition that I'm playing. Anyway, right now you can barely go anywhere. All the towns are naturally locked off due to time compression because, well, it'd be rather silly if you could quickly stop at Timber for a bit and talk to someone about the resistance against Galbadia who hasn't had their speech updated since, like, Disc 1. Balaam Garden, well, isn't even on the map. There is someone on the Ragnarok who can sell you supplies if you need them, and you can still use the plane to get around if you feel like you need to level more or get more spells and so forth, and you can still obtain Odin, Bahamut and Eden from their locations if you haven't already. Other than that, this is the end of the game. The world is empty. There is nothing but the last dungeon. I've complained a lot about the quality of the dungeons throughout the game, that most of them seem to be rather lazy cut and paste efforts. The sewers, D-District Prison, Galbadia Garden, and so on. Either that or there's only a few screens in them. The Lunatic Pandora in the end is a good example of that. I can see what happened now. All of the big effort into making dungeons went into Ultimecia's castle. Considering that most of the last disc is this dungeon, yeah, it's worth it. A truly fantastic, huge dungeon that's filled with stuff to do. The main gimmick of the castle is that while in there, most of your commands are sealed off. You literally only start with attack. There are 7 bosses inside the castle, and you can unlock one command for each one you beat. Hell, it's possible to go straight through everything and head to Ultimecia's master room if you want and trigger the final battle. Although chances are you would lose. Also, you split into 2 parties and use these weird points to switch between them. This is only actually used in one of the dungeon's puzzles, but it is also helpful if you want to quickly switch to the second party, who start just inside the entrance, and get out of the castle if you want to save. As far as unlocking commands go, well, it depends. Items are good to have, as is magic. You definitely want ways of healing yourself available as quickly as possible. If there's any GFs that you missed, you can also draw them from the bosses in the castle. It kinda depends on how you play. There was one hairy moment. I faced one boss with my second weaker party, who I wasn't able to heal after putting the junctions on them with only attacks and limits at my disposal, and the boss had high defense against physical attacks. Fortunately, Quistis's micro missiles and Irvine's shot got me through. Just about. It was pretty hairy. As you get more commands, the bosses become fairly easy, seeing as you use the same strategy against all of them. You start with Meltdown, and then bash them with physical attacks, perhaps using Aura for limit breaks against some. And there is also a special puzzle that summons a mega weapon, the single strongest enemy in the game. Whether you do that or not, it's a damn good dungeon, where you kick back and just enjoy the excellent graphics, surroundings, and music. Finally though, after going up a spiral staircase and traversing a long bridge, you reach the Master Room, ideally with all the commands unlocked. Will we get the big evil speech that we've all been waiting for, now that we're finally facing Ultimecia? Of course we have already had some. We did have all that she spouted when she was in control of a deer after all. She certainly knows us, calling us locusts that swarm across generations, which, to be fair, we kind of did do when we were going through this compression. Eventually though, she does keep things short. It's time for the big fight, and if the final dungeon itself was pretty damn good, the final boss fight itself, that's even better. The fight starts as follows. The first form is simply herself, and she casts high level magic against 3 party members she picks at random. If and when a party member is knocked out, they will be absorbed into time if not revived after a turn, and another member will replace them. The battle only ends once all members are defeated. In the end, you will very likely be left with your 3 actual good fighters, the ones you've junctioned. As it is, Squall started with Zell and Quistis by his side for the first form. Zell and Quistis had nothing on them, so they died quickly, which brought Irvine and Selphie into play. And hey, this at least meant I could start doing proper damage. Irvine died just before the first form finished, alas. So long, cowboy. After a bit of a beating, Ultimecia decides to cash out of the battle temporarily and bring in a new force, Griever. You may know that name already. Back in the Battle of the Gardens, Rinoa returned Squall's ring that Zell had borrowed. That said ring had a sort of image of a lion on it, and you could actually give it a name. Griever is Squall's ultimate idea of a GF that Ultimecia creates from that ring in order to fight the party now. It is also possible that you gave Squall's ring a silly name when asked to, which might cheapen the dramatic power the scene can have. Griever's attacks are mainly physical, but he also has the powerful shockwave pulsar at his disposal. You may well want to heal after that one. After beating on Griever a little bit, Ultimecia decides to go into second form and junction herself with Griever, creating this quite repulsive looking beast. It wouldn't be a final battle without all of these stages after all. Ulti Griever means business. She can summon monsters, cast Ultima, use very nasty physicals. It's best to get rid of her quick. In storyline, getting rid of her means overcoming Griever, this manifestation that was born out of Squall's mind, essentially overcoming his own issues in the final battle. There's no better cure for that than Renzakuken. But of course, it isn't over. Once Ulti Griever is done, we get the true form of Ultimecia, right in the middle of time compression. A creepy theme is introduced, which then suddenly kicks into a remix of the classic Final Fantasy boss theme, possibly the best music in the whole game. This is the toughest battle of the lot for various reasons. She can cast Hell's Judgment on the party, which reduces everybody's HP to 1. She can also entirely deplete your stocks of magic, even if they're junctioned, which can have a very nasty effect on your characters. Suddenly, a really powerful character is a weakling. She also has a spell called Apocalypse, and if you haven't healed properly after Hell's Judgment, yeah, that's game over. Once her lower half is revealed, you can actually draw Apocalypse from her and cast it if you wish. It will hurt her. After a lot of healing and battering, as well as Rinoa getting knocked out, Ultimecia starts a final speech. It's actually a fairly somber statement. In full, she says, "Reflect on your childhood, your sensation, your words, your emotions. Time, it will not wait, no matter how hard you hold on. It escapes you, and... She only starts saying this once her HP's gone, but she says it in segments and you have to keep attacking, especially because she herself can still attack during this time, even if she does at this point seemingly accept her fate. The speech is never finished, and is the last bit, and with one last attack, Ultimecia is defeated, thus ending one of the greatest final boss battles in the whole of the Final Fantasy series. Seriously, this entire final dungeon, yeah, the best gameplay was definitely saved until last. Although Ultimecia is defeated, our characters are stuck in the void with seemingly no way of escaping. They can only cling on to the one idea that Laguna had, that if you think of a place where you want to be, then that's where you'll eventually end up. It seems like the majority of our characters do find a way, except for Squall. He's still struggling against himself. We get a long look at this internal fight, in particular as he tries to remember Rinoa. The scene where Squall first met Rinoa is constantly replayed, but distorted each time, with Squall unable to remember anything clearly. There's plenty of images in this montage, some of them quite shocking. I mean, you've probably all seen that one image of Squall with a big hole where his face is supposed to be, haven't you? Squall is trying to get to where he needs to go, but is still finding nothing but grey bleakness. For Rinoa, the white is replaced by the field, and a feather is something that both Rinoa and Squall can cling onto. She sees him in the field, but Squall doesn't hear her, and in the end there is still one more place Squall needs to go as time compression falters. We go back to the orphanage, years ago, with a young Squall and a matronly Adele, who stumbles upon Ultimecia, or what's left of her. She is thoroughly beaten, but she cannot die, not until she passes her powers on. And so she does, to Adele. Afterwards, Adele runs into the adult Squall, who tells her that she must form Seed. The end of the story is the beginning of this story. It seems that Ultimecia's plan to become the all-powerful sorceress and ruler of time was always fated to end this way, and will always end this way. In creating her plan in order to get revenge on those who wronged sorceresses in the past, she sealed her own fate. Back in the field, finally, with Squall appearing close to death, the feather brings him back. Time, it seems, has been restored to where it was. As we move into the ending sequence properly, you get to see how various people's storylines finish. Seifer is now free of his sorceress fascination, and is having fun fishing with Fujin and Raijin as Balaam Garden passes over his head. It's a great symbolic shot in which he's become the fallen angel, basically. Laguna remembers when he proposed to Rain as he pays a visit to her grave with Alone, and in the end, well, the folks at Garden have a bit of a party with everyone dorking off as usual, and Rinoa outside with Squall, who we do not see until the very end. Mind you, it is possible that he could have just been the one holding the camera. Everything's all fine, at least for now. Ultimecia is still in the future, but we know how the story ends. And that's how this story ends. Roll the credits. So, final thoughts? Final Fantasy VIII is undoubtedly a very interesting game. There's nothing all that much like it, either in the history of the series itself or in JRPGs generally. It's been a long ride and, yeah, there are flaws in how ridiculous the storyline gets, and sometimes how everything seems to be hung together by strands of spittle. But for all those issues, I'd be lying if I said that I didn't enjoy like 90 to 95% of my time spent with Final Fantasy VIII, and if I said that I didn't grow to love the journey and warm to its characters. Most of them anyway. I highly recommend playing Final Fantasy VIII if you haven't. Not necessarily because you'll think it's a brilliant game, as more than any other game I've ever reviewed, there's a definite your mileage may vary sticker on it. This is a game that you either love or hate. But as a manual for storytelling, and in particular combining story, characters and gameplay, it's filled with so many ideas. A lot of them are rough, but they're novel. Many of them would not be taken up by Square. After this and FF7, not to mention the proto-industrial FF6, Final Fantasy IX, which was developed at the same time as FF8, was presented and seen as something a lot closer to the series' roots. Final Fantasy X, the first PS2 entry into the series that started development as FF8 was released, would do its own thing. As such, there's lots of things about FF8 that represent a road not taken in design, making it a unique entry in the series that should be experienced and can be appreciated no matter how much experience you have with Final Fantasy or JRPGs as a whole. Square tried to create a game that would appeal to everyone, from the most dedicated RPG fan to the casual. In many ways it's like a JRPG sandbox where you can use junctions to build any character into exactly what you want them to be, and you can pretty much start doing that from the get-go. It's not exactly the most stable system, put mildly, but some people love that experimental side of the game. It all depends. Either way, it's hardly a game that you can just be meh about. Personally, it's certainly not something that I regret. It hooked me in pretty quickly, annoyed me and frustrated me at times, just as Squall did Rinoa, but ultimately, yeah, I kinda loved it. But, well, we're still not done. What about that ending, and what it really means? And what about those two theories that always come up when people talk about the game? Squall is dead, Rinoa is Ultimecia. I've waited until the game itself was finished to talk about them, otherwise I would have had to talk about them in stages, which would just be annoying, especially when the ending itself is such an integral part to both theories. Right, Squall is dead first. This is a fan theory that seemed to develop in the mid-noughties from forums and what have you, but ended up gathering a fair bit of steam. In short, the theory posits that Squall died when Adele stuck an icicle through his chest, and the rest of this game is his pre-death dream. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this theory, and I don't really buy it, but it's worth going through its main points. The whole thing is available to read at squallisdead.com. The first point is, of course, what happens to Squall's big wound. After Squall realises it has healed, it's not mentioned for the rest of the game. People assume that Adele healed Squall so he could be interrogated, although that doesn't hold because Squall is a new member of Seed and thus could not reasonably be expected to know much. Maybe though Adele healed him due to a matron tendency that could still be there, not to mention that it wouldn't have been the right time for him to die. I do understand the theory. It comes from the usual routine that every death or knockout in battle is non-canon, but any death in cutscene is, something that Iris obviously demonstrated in the last game. But did Squall actually die there? One other thing worth noting is that it's not the only time that we see Adele's ice spikes. The ice strike is actually her limit break. You can use it when you play as Adele. It does a fair bit of damage, but it's not an insta-kill attack or anything. So, was it there? There's certainly doubt about that. Another point to the theory is that there's lots of weird things all over the place once you get into Disc 2. Moombas, Shumis, floating gardens. How can this be real? Surely it's all a dream. I don't like this part because it seems like trying to apply real-life logic to a JRPG, which you just can't do. What about all the monsters running about before Squall takes the icicle to the chest? Those are acceptable, but Moombas aren't? Come on now, you just can't be consistent with that. It's not like FF doesn't have a history with friendly people who aren't necessarily human either. There's also the fact that fate becomes a constant theme in the game, especially after Disc 1. Yeah, perhaps, but that doesn't necessarily equal dead protagonist. Sure, it's said that Squall is fated to be the leader of Seed even though he's just a cadet, but as explained, there's literally no other choice. To be honest, I think Sid's just buffing Squall up there. Being fated to fight Seifer and Adele is also explained too, really, even if GFs and other greater forces are a big part of that. Then there's the establishment of Seifer and Rinoa in Disc 1 as the actual relationship, thus making Squall and Rinoa, which doesn't really get going until Disc 2, the dream relationship with a touch of the Vanilla Sky about it, whereas Rinoa and Seifer doesn't get that much of an airing after Disc 1, at least if you ignore when it does at the end of Disc 2, which the theory does. It also relies on characters never changing from the moment they're introduced, which they clearly do. We know that Rinoa and Seifer had a fling, and that's how she became aware of Seed, and Rinoa speaks of possibly being in love in the aftermath of Seifer's death, which is a perfectly natural reaction to loss, by the way. It doesn't mean that the love is actually genuine. Quistis even goes into this at the orphanage, in fact, thinking that something's love when it actually isn't. There's just not enough there to make that relationship concrete, honestly. Now, the ending is naturally where the theory is strongest. The whole sequence where Squall's lost in the abyss, and a lot of different memories flash back. Everything from Seifer to Delin to Rinoa at the party, who constantly appears in distorted images. This could be interpreted as Squall losing touch with his memories finally as he reaches the end of his dream. And then, in the end, Rinoa finally finds Squall and he appears to be dead until the feathers fly up. We don't even get a proper sight of Squall at all until the final shot of the whole game, with Rinoa and Squall out on the balcony. There's no denying that Squall being dead is one way to interpret this whole thing, especially with some of the shots that appear, or indeed a lot of the other FMV shots seemingly centering around the events of Disc 1. Perhaps. Still, there is a general problem that I have with the theory as a whole in that I don't think it particularly improves the story at all. Doesn't "oh, it was all a dream" just seem kind of unsatisfying? That's the sort of ending that usually comes in for massive criticism when it's employed, and rightly so. Frankly, the whole thing being a dream, if that was the intention, makes the story feel like a bit of a waste of time and kind of cheapens the whole experience. I guess that's why I just don't jive with Squall is Dead all that much. I feel like if that was the case and Square had made it obvious, then people would care for FF8 a hell of a lot less than they already do. On to the second one then. Rinoa is Ultimecia. This theory posits that Rinoa, being a sorceress, is destined to become Ultimecia in the future as all of the friends she has die, she loses her knight, and loses her grasp on reality. She becomes angry at the way sorceresses are treated, and takes her revenge. Now this theory to me is a bit more interesting. Some say that Square have openly said that the theory isn't correct, although I can never find exact proof of that. It's said in FF8's book that sorceresses have a lifespan as long as a normal person, but also that a sorceress cannot die until they have passed their powers on to someone else. So that still seems a trifle open-ended. Square have also paid a bit more lip service to the theory in one of the Dissidia games, where Ultimecia's weapons share Rinoa's weapons names. It's an older theory than Squall is Dead, first coming up sometime in 2001. The theory is mainly based around foreshadowings, Adele saying that Squall must fight to the end even if it will bring tragedy in others, or Rinoa saying that it's okay if she ends up being killed by Squall and only by Squall while dealing with her newfound sorceress abilities. There are also certain similarities between Rinoa and Ultimecia. Winds play quite a big part in both of their designs, they have similar facial structures and so on. And one of the big points is the summoning of Griever in the final fight, a guardian force that Ultimecia creates from Squall's Rin, and one that Rinoa knows about too. Indeed, she's the only other person who knows about Griever because she wanted a Rin just like it. Is it significant also that Ultimecia, in her sorceress form, has lion's feet? Rinoa is Ultimecia certainly gives the ending a different sort of twist. If it's true that Rinoa is fated to become Ultimecia, then the end of the game is actually quite downcast, especially for a Final Fantasy game. Most of the time FF games like to wrap things up on a more positive note, rather than saying that ultimately, once Squall is dead and all of these other people are, Rinoa will live on and ultimately cause this particular world crisis, which Squall and company will resolve in the future by killing her. But then Final Fantasy VIII does do a lot of things differently to other games in the series. It also certainly helps with the weakest part of Ultimecia, her complete lack of character development, and it does rather work thematically with the game's themes about fate. Maybe this connection is what Square were going for with Ultimecia's final, sombre lines that are so at odds with how her character behaves through the rest of the game. It's not often that Final Fantasy's antagonists get that sort of final speech. I quite like the theory. I think if it were the case, it would definitely add an extra layer to the game. But do I believe it? Not sure. There's not really any kind of smoking gun to be found, either here or with Squall is Dead. And a theory is, in the end, just a theory. A lot of the evidence is open to different interpretations, and some of it could just be coincidental. Either way, they're fun to speculate on, and they can be fun to argue about, so long as no one gets too hectic about it. But then this is Final Fantasy VIII we're talking about, so obviously they do. And with that, well, that about wraps it up. I'm not sure if there's all that much more I can say. Except of course to thank you for joining me on this rather epic 5-part journey. It's certainly been one hell of a ride, and even if FF8 isn't a game that I have as much experience with as I do with FF7, hopefully I was able to do right by it. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this video then please do like it. You could also subscribe to the channel, check me on my Facebook or my Twitter, or indeed my Patreon if you'd like to see things like Google Hangouts or Skype chats or review requests and all that good shit. Now for this video I would like to thank the following: Adam Schaefer, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Soley, Conformist, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Grafton Blackpool, Guy Middleton, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, John Scott, Keith Barlow, Kyle F, L. O'Brien, Lee Norris, ManagerSim.net, Mark Heslop, Mark Johnston, Mark Whittington, Martin Pataki, Nanette McCrone, Olaf Allbean, Pete Morris, Peter Sidorn, Filter Prog, Potter Margell, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Wyatt Coleman, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Taylor Armand, The Unnatural, Tanya J, Twisted Squote, Vishar D, and Yerka Operator.